Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this webinar to discuss Russian misinformation and the strategies to combat misinformation. This webinar is arranged by the European Commission's office in Copenhagen. My name is Jakob Nielsen. I'm the editor-in-chief of independent Danish media Altinget, and I'm going to moderate today's event. Before getting into the actual event, I want to make clear that everyone watching can contribute with questions at any time using the formula on the right side of this video screen. We will try to accommodate as many questions as possible during the next 90 minutes event. So, following Russia's attack on Ukraine in February, the 27 EU member states in March jointly agreed to sanction the transmission of Russia Today and Sputnik within the EU. This is the first time ever that this tool has been used to stop the spread of targeted disinformation from a third country. The sanctions have been heavily criticized by media organizations and journalists all over Europe and in the US. Some say that the Western countries should defend media freedom and freedom of speech at all cost, and that limiting access to Russian media organizations is in fact a way of confirming Russia's claim that European values is a nice talking point only, but not in reality more open or more democratic than what is happening in Russia. So in today's seminar, we're going to try to understand what Russian misinformation, what Russian information strategy is actually about from some of the people who know the most about the topic. We also want to take a look at the potential harmful consequences of limiting free access to media organizations from a country like Russia. We have an excellent, and I actually want to say world-class panel of experts from 4 different countries, and I will introduce the panel as we go forward, but let me just say that you will meet a Danish foreign policy expert who has been working with Russia for decades. You will meet the co-chairman of the Danish Union of Journalists. You will meet a Finnish investigative reporter and author who has been trying to expose Russian troll armies and much more. You will meet an American television journalist who has actually worked for Russia Today, and you will meet a Russian editor who is working to fact-check Russian media. So a lot of good stuff coming on for the next 90 minutes. This is the topic for today, and I can't wait to get started with the panel, but actually as an extra asset for today, we have the possibility to welcome the ambassador of Ukraine to Denmark, Mr. Vidoinik Mikhailu, and I want to see if the ambassador is with us now.
Yes, hi. I think you can hear me well, Kurt?
Absolutely, I can hear you. How are you today, ambassador?
Well, I'm fine, of course, because I'm out of my country, but of course the mood is not good, let's be honest.
Of course, we understand that. I'm hoping that today you will tell us a little bit about why the Ukraine actually put a ban on Russia Today as early as 2014, and perhaps also give us an idea about the consequences of Russian misinformation in Ukraine. So please, Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Okay, many thanks. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'll be honest with you, I'm not an expert in media or freedom of speech, so I will have rather maybe an amateur assessment of the situation where we are right now. But you are right, and we have to admit that Russia actually launched a hybrid information war against my country long before the invasion back in 2014. And it was actually maybe Ukraine that became a testing ground where the latest information and psychological warfare technologies were tested. So I must say that Russia spent a huge amount of money. According to different assessment, every year nearly 3 to 4 billion of US dollar were spent to wage this hybrid war against Ukraine. And the money were used to create different information resources, to purchase materials, to promote this information, the fake news, this Russian propaganda in general, as we used to say. The reason for banning the Russian channels was very simple, because we definitely saw that the freedom of speech is abused by Russia, and it became a very good and strong tool to influence not just the Ukrainian minds, but also to influence the rest of the civilized world. You know, we in the democratic societies used to rely very much on journalism, on freedom of speech, on fair and unbiased press, because we used to trust those information, and we always hoped that journalists who were writing these articles, that they feel responsible for what information they are delivering to their viewers and readers. But as we learned a very bad lesson from our past, Russia was very professional in abusing this right and using this tool to influence other countries of the world, including and in particular Ukraine. So in our assessment, actually, this deliberate, uncontrolled dissemination of false and harmful information in itself became a threat of freedom of speech. And actually, in the healthy information environment, disinformation spreads like a virus and destroys it very successfully. And that was the reason why we took this difficult decision, but I think it was very right decision that we immediately banned broadcasting Russian TV channels in Ukraine, because we saw that Russia was using those channels as a very useful tool to influence on Ukraine, to influence on our political life, but also in general on the life of Ukrainians. So I do agree with you, and I was saying that when internet was invented, when social media became let's say affordable for everyone in the world, so they actually erased the borders between the states, and these created both very good tool for people to use and to have access to of course to information, but on the other hand it created also a good ground for those who would like to abuse with this access and to manipulate and to use the information in order to wage the war against other countries. So Ukraine became a victim of this war, and right now this war continues and became also not just information but a real war against Ukraine. And that was actually our lessons learned, and that's what I urge also other countries. We are grateful that EU finally took this decision, although you are saying that there is a lot of criticism of that. But then you should ask perhaps what is the freedom of speech in itself, and what punishment should actually go after this freedom is violated, because the journalists and journalism should also bear responsibility for the information they are trying to deliver to the societies. So that was, I think, the reason, and I'm sure about that, why we stopped spreading this fake news and spreading this propaganda, because we cannot call them the freedom of speech, we cannot call them the unbiased press. It's actually very dependent press and very dangerous press. As we can see, it became a very dangerous tool in the hands of Kremlin regime, as they have plenty of resources, a lot of financial resources to wage this war and to continue, creating these fake news. So I think one of the goals even for today's discussion should be, where is this watershed? Where is this line between allowing freedom of speech, or still the states should, or some agencies should control somehow the amount of information which is delivered on purpose from one of the source. And usually this source, follows its own policy, which doesn't, coincide with the policy of democratic and civilized world. So I would encourage, of course, people who are participating today to exchange thoughts and opinions about, where is this waterline? Where is this limit, or should be put on the freedom of speech, actually, and who should control this freedom of speech? Because it comes to be a really very powerful tool, and as you can see, we are also trying, to fight back this propaganda. And our president, as a leader of this democratic world, I would say today, he is trying to deliver in his everyday speeches this truth about the situation in Ukraine, which is extremely important also, first and foremost, for Ukrainians, because they understand where Ukraine is currently, and that was a really big achievement in current Ukraine, that we have this one voice, let's say, a policy to deliver this true information to the audience. So I will maybe put a full stop here and encourage all the participants to discuss this issue. But I do believe that freedom of speech should also go with some kind of either self-control or control imposed by whoever could be, because otherwise we will lose control of everything, and then it may be a chaos in this information. So thank you once again. Apologize, maybe it was not the things which you expected from me to deliver, but these are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think that was exactly what we were hoping for, to get this first-hand impression of what being in the center of a misinformation war, what are the consequences of that. So thank you for bringing us that. We could continue this conversation for a long time, but as you just mentioned, we really want to share the thoughts of the panel also to get a broader view on this. We will now go on to those, but I really want to thank you for being with us today, and best of luck with the struggle that you are leading at the moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a nice conversation today.
Thank you. And then just before we move on, I just want to make clear that there will be a link to this whole webinar made accessible after the meeting has finished, so that everyone who would want to can watch it again or share it with friends. So now that should be in place. Let's now move on to our first speaker, who is with me here in the studio in Copenhagen. That is to my right, Mr. Søren Liborius, welcome.
Thank you.
Søren, you are a senior expert, to say the least, a very experienced foreign policy worker. You have been working in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you have many years of experience also in the European Union External Action Service, the foreign service of the European Union. You've been working also in Russia, and of course, but you are a fluent Russian speaker, so you're someone with a deep knowledge of Russian society and the Russian media. So we will ask you to first do your presentation and then move on from there, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this presentation and discussion today. I'm looking very much forward to it. I will, over the next couple of minutes, try to explain in more detail what is the EU member states' decision regarding Russia Today, RT, and Sputnik really about? Where does RT and Sputnik fit into the media operation the Kremlin is running, and using their own words to describe them? And finally, also to shed some light on where the RT and Sputnik as special tools fit into the modern information warfare strategy that is deployed from the Russian side. I have a number of slides to show. I hope that viewers can see them. They will also be made available after this discussion here. Now, just what are we talking about? We are talking about, as Jakob said in the introduction, a decision to limit the spread, the dissemination of RT and Sputnik inside the EU. This is not censorship. We're not kicking out journalists. We're not arresting RT and Sputnik journalists. We're not confiscating property. It is, and only that, the dissemination on the RT and Sputnik signals on internet platforms such as cable TV, internet-borne information platforms. It is a decision by the EU member states taken in unanimous decision, as always when we are talking about sanctions on other countries, and it concerns the RT Russia Today, English, UK, German, France, Spanish versions, and the Sputnik platforms, which is the web arm of the media operation. It is important also to stress that the decision is taken for the duration of the war in Ukraine. It is a very specific situation, so it's not a blanket outlawing of a media operation. And what is also important is that it only targets these two kinds of operators and not the whole Russian state media landscape. You can here on the screen see the reference to the official journal decision. There was a press release sent out on the 2nd of March. I will not read it out to you, but it stresses here that it is because the EU member states have realized that RT and Sputnik in particular are weaponized tools of warfare in the current crisis against Ukraine and the aggression there. A few things about what is actually RT and Sputnik, and there's been a lot of discussion about this in Danish media debate recently, and I think that it is proper to identify themselves with their own words. Now, I would claim that RT and Sputnik is actually more a Ministry of Defense propaganda arm. They do not want to go by objective journalistic standards. That's their own perception. And they are actually part of a much larger disinformation system running from the Kremlin. They are, as modern media, very capable of exploiting the online information environment, and the Sputnik platform in particular aims to go bypassing editorial processes, journalistic newsrooms and so on, and straight to you as a user. There has been in the past a number of instances where RT has come into trouble with the laws and regulations in a number of EU member states. And if we look at the current situation, the invasion in Ukraine has skyrocketed the activity of RT and Sputnik globally. Let's take a look at how they define themselves, and on the slide you can see the editor-in-chief, Margarita Simonian. She equated a couple of years ago the RT with the need you would have as a state like the one you have for a defense ministry. If you can just, if you're a Danish viewer here, picture the head of the Danish national broadcaster saying that I'm actually the information arm of the Danish Ministry of Defense, you will probably whoop a little bit. Now, in her own quote, the RT would be capable of conducting an information war against the whole Western world, using this information weapon. You may sit tight in your chair and say, did she really say that? Yes, she said that. And she continued in another interview stating that the aim is to conquer and grow an audience which could be mobilized at a critical moment. We are now at such a critical moment with the war in Ukraine. A couple of days ago, she voiced in a very long discussion on a Sunday evening TV program her view that censorship and political control in Russia is not only good, it is also necessary. And she was going on about constructing a society much like that in China, very much controlled in those spheres. Now, this is one of the reasons why RT and Sputnik stands out in comparison with all other Russian media. The head of the media operation, the Rossiya Сегодня, Mr. Dmitry Kiselyov, a long time under EU sanctions, said that when the new media conglomerate was born, that the period of impartial journalism is over and objectivity is a myth. He runs the media operation with a clear goal in mind to broadcast what is good and necessary for Russia. Old-style journalism checks here the different sides to a story. No, out that goes. What is RT and Sputnik in the global scheme? It is really a global operation, which I said could be best compared to that of a propaganda department of a Ministry of Defense. It boasts itself of, as you can see on the screen here, some 4.6 million subscribers and 7.4 million followers on YouTube. Sputnik is available in more than 20 languages around the world, and it's a global media operation which has accelerated its activity here in the Ukraine war. You can see the budget figures down here, but to a Danish audience, the RT operation would run around 3 billion Danish kroner a year just for its operation. So that's a handsome amount of money. Of course, it is having very close ties with President Putin. RT is registered and listed as one of the strategic assets of the Russian Federation. A strategic enterprise that needs to be supported, promoted, especially in times of crisis. And a few words about how it has been covering the conflict and war in Ukraine. You can basically take what you hear in most credible media and flip it upside down. The Ukraine is run by a bunch of neo-Nazis, and they need to be cleansed from Nazism, of course, and the purpose is to save the people from the genocide that the Kiev government has been running for years. It has recently also been jockeying heavily on the claim that United States is running biolabs, chemical weapons developments, or that Ukraine has developed nuclear weapons just ready to be detonated over Russia soon. It is tailored to different audiences, and also in Russia, in Belarus, the preparations for a Ukraine attack was broadly promoted, especially to Belarus audiences and also to other smaller members of the SNG. The RT operation in English is an umbrella that feeds a lot of material to the other language versions. But if you want to see about the RT, you can always visit our platform EU versus Disinfo and see more stories that are covered there. Now, one of the successes of RT here in the Ukraine war has been that it has been able to have a large say in especially the Chinese media landscape, but also across Africa and Latin America, and it is used heavily as a source there. A few words to conclude where RT fits into the Russian modern information warfare doctrine. Some will know it as the Gerasimov doctrine, which says, and I have condensed it here, which that the next conflict will be taking place in all domains, also the cognitive, the information domain. Russia needs to control and mobilize its forces to be active there. And if Russia does not, the foe will do it, and it will be used against Russia. So there is a clear position for RT to be engaged. And for those of you that are Russian readers, here you can see a graphic illustration from the Gerasimov doctrine, his own article, where you will see the space between the gray bottom and the blue center is where warfare goes into from semi-war to full war. That information warfare is crucial. RT fits into a larger set of tools that the Russian state has in its control, meaning also diplomatic, also military intelligence, also the censorship agency Roskomnadzor or media watchdog, and RT is heavily under the control of the presidential administration. If you want to have more information about how RT is being analyzed, you're also very welcome to visit our online resource, EU versus Disinfo. I will end with saying that if you as a user of RT and Sputnik felt that you were just using normal information tools equal to many other platforms, you should probably revisit your own conviction and understand that you have been kind of misused and you have been bypassed from the Russian state media information operation to be in the center of their attention and I would say to a large degree also the potentially manipulated. There is a set of surveys that clearly demonstrate that information manipulation is highly successful and propaganda works. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Søren. And I think this presentation alone raises a lot of questions. I will limit myself to one or two right now, and we will come back to some of the others later. But the first question I want to ask is one that has actually also been asked by a couple of the participants who are watching the seminar. And it's more or less the same question, just formulated in different ways. Bo Nissen Knudsen says, I do not believe that this is not censorship is a viable argument against the fact that the sanctions are obviously a kind of censorship. Would any other arguments be available, is his question. And another user asks, why not admit that this is censorship when that is obviously what it is? What would your response be to the claim that this is censorship and we should be open about it?
Well, we're not shying away from the fact that it is a restriction of transmission inside the EU. RT journalists are free to conduct interviews and research even here inside the EU and broadcast where they want outside the EU. So we're not censoring content. Now, if it is the question about a restriction on the access to RT and Sputnik, if we define censorship as that, yes, it is a restriction, because RT, unlike Russian state media in general, is, by their own words, as you have seen, a weaponized tool in information warfare. It is okay to say, I want to be exposed, to be bombarded with information warfare. We were bombarded on the 9th of April 1940 by a leaflet dropped from German Air Force planes with uproar to the Danish people. It is okay to say, I am ready to do that. Now, you should just not be surprised that the governments of the EU member states feel different, and that modern information warfare is fought with these tools.
But I think to a lot of Danes, and I can see there's also a question coming in here, so I'm very lucky to have the viewers asking the same questions that I have on my paper. A popular opinion in Denmark is that still this is overshooting, since most people in the European Union, in Denmark and in other countries, are relatively well educated and should very well be able to judge for themselves, and they are also aware that Russian media channels are not very trustworthy. So why do they need some kind of EU parenting to tell them not to watch this? Wouldn't they be able to sort out information and misinformation for themselves?
In the long run, manipulating the agenda, setting another agenda to which you will be exposed. And people should be aware that when they have their phone, their feed is manipulated by artificial behavior, bots and so on. So the conviction that I, as a Danish citizen, I'm immune to manipulation is, I must say, grossly naive.
But let me just then ask you one final question. Then what is the reason that the EU did not take similar measures to restrict American tech giants like Facebook and Twitter during American elections, or maybe even more relevant, during the Brexit election? There was loads of misinformation coming from completely untrustworthy organizations, media organizations and other, but the EU did not put any measures in place, and that was about affairs that related to ourselves and to our own societies.
I think it's fair to say that the center of gravity in the discussion has moved, and we have all been very much more aware since the 6th of January storm on the Capitol Hill, and you will have recently heard that the Digital Services Act, being now discussed in the EU, is setting, I would say, a new landscape. We're not out doing mind policing. We're not out doing thought policing. We're out at protecting some of the tools that can be used to undermine the security in the EU.
Okay, thank you very much. This, just as the Ukrainian ambassador, is also a very interesting element of the discussion. It could go on for much longer, hopefully it will. But I want to say thank you for now for giving us this perspective on what has actually been decided in the EU and what the restrictions are actually about. I will now turn to you, Allan Boye Thulstrup. You are the co-chairman of the Danish Union of Journalists, and you have been one of the organizations, not the only one by far, but one of the organizations criticizing these measures, in a moment you will explain why. I just want to underline, before I give you the floor, that you are not here in any way as a defender of RT or Sputnik. Obviously, you're just as critical towards misinformation as anyone else. So that is not the point of your participation here. You're here to give us some ideas about how you look at the concepts of freedom of expression and freedom of information. So please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to participate here. A very interesting panel, and as the Ukrainian ambassador said, this is a difficult decision and discussion. Where is the watershed of disinformation and freedom of speech? And it's important that we keep discussing that, because I don't think we will ever be finished discussing it. And one of the reasons we will never be finished discussing it is because we have freedom of speech. We have the ability to have all kind of opinions in the European Union. In the chapter of fundamental rights of the European Union, Article 11 is the freedom of speech and the free media. That is at the core of the European Union. If you start chipping away at the core, you start losing some of the meaning of the Union. And I see this as a little bit of chip in the core. Once you start banning certain channels of information, you have started compromising on freedom of speech. We all agree that Sputnik and RT are not reliable sources of information. But you can only do a thing for the first time once. Now the EU has established that it is possible to ban certain channels of information. Never again can we say in the European Union we believe in the freedom of speech and it's absolute, except in, from now on we have to say, except in certain areas. And that could be a problem in the future. We have hundreds of millions, billions of people living in countries without freedom of speech who look to the European Union as one of the places with freedom of speech. Now we have Russia, possibly other despots. They have the ability to say even the European Union bans channels of information. I don't call them media, even though in some countries maybe they would be labeled as media. We know that in many countries media are state-controlled, channels of information are state-controlled. So for many people this is a natural state. If we believe that the way we do it in the European Union should be an example for the rest of the world, then we also have to be very careful not to chip away at the core, as I said. Then it's easy standing here and saying it was the wrong decision. What could have been done instead, you might ask? I know a lot of different initiatives are already taking place, trying to educate Russians, trying to reach the Russian population with different information, with free and independent news. I know a lot of different initiatives are done to counteract the spreading of disinformation. If we had chosen to strengthen that, that might have made a difference. Right now we are in a situation where the decision to ban 2 sources of information, 2 out of many hundred sources of information, kind of overshadows all the other things. It becomes the focus of the discussion we have and takes away attention from all the other things that should also be done, could be done. In the long run, I think media literacy, targeted and focused media literacy campaign in all European countries, in all countries by large, and that is really in the long run, would be the way to explain why free and independent media is important to a democracy, to a population, to proper government, to make that argument and spread that argument out to as many people as possible would be the long run solution. But obviously that is in the long run, as I said. But in short, I think by making this decision, we have played into the hands of despots everywhere. despots and demagogues who can now say even the EU bans channels of information. And that, I am afraid, could lead to consequences that weren't the intention behind this decision. Yes.
Thank you very much, Allan, for this perspective on the debate. And I think you made your point very clearly, but I just want to ask you one follow-up question. We heard the Ukrainian ambassador in the beginning saying that Russian media organizations, and he was talking way back to 2014, around the time when we also had the invasion in Crimea. He said that Russian media organization and Russia misinformation in Ukraine led to civil unrest, even to violence, and that misinformation actually became a threat to freedom of speech itself. So as I perfectly understand your points and your points of principle, I still want to ask you, is it not necessary to not limit your focus to the situation in a relatively safe and well-educated country as Denmark or many other Western European countries or EU countries, and to acknowledge that the situation might be very different and that different measures might be necessary in order simply to prevent war?
Obviously, I'm speaking from a very privileged position as an inhabitant in a democratic country. And situations can be different in different countries. But if we believe that freedom of speech and free media is a principle worth fighting for, I think we also have to identify how can we fight for that principle in other countries. How can we help other countries fight misinformation without having to limit the freedom of speech? Because once you start limiting freedom of speech, it becomes a slippery slope. And even in the EU, we have countries with state-controlled media in the members. And the slippery slope, obviously I don't think the Commission is there, but already we have different sanctions aimed at the financial parts of specific countries. And if the slippery slope becomes too slippery, all of a sudden we have a situation where we ban state-controlled channels or media in many countries.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. I think we also have questions coming in. A very short remark here from Søren, but then we really need to go to our excellent panel sitting outside of Denmark. So just a very short remark, Søren.
A very short remark, thank you very much, to saying that I fully support that we should do as much as we can to also help Russian journalism. And we are, luckily from the EU side, spending a lot of resources and a lot of energy exactly on supporting Russian journalism inside, outside Russia.
Mm-hmm. We also have more questions for you coming in, Søren, so I'm sure we're going to get back to you because there are many of the viewers of this webinar who are very critical to the idea of what they see as censorship, so we're definitely getting back into that discussion. But now I want to take us outside of the borders of Denmark. That is really one of the main purposes of this event as well. And I want to start with you, Roman Dobrokotov. I'm trying to pronounce your name, but you've assured me that you'll be okay even with my bad Danish pronunciation of your name. But thank you for being with us. You are a Russian investigative journalist and editor-in-chief of the Russian independent media called The Insider. It was founded and operates founded in 2013 and operates from Riga in Latvia, so inside the EU. And I want to state also that you are living outside of Russia today. In 2019, you were you received the European Press Prize Investigative Reporting Award. And Roman, please give us your perspective on fact-checking Russia media and on this whole discussion.
Yeah, so we actually operated physically from Moscow till the last year. So we were just registered in Latvia. But we operated from Russia while it was possible. So it stopped being possible last year when FSB broke into my apartment in the middle of the night. They searched my apartment, took all my computers and phones. They searched also apartments of my relatives and relatives of my relatives. So it happened with almost all my colleagues who are investigative journalists. So in the last year, most of them, all of them actually had to leave Russia because it's now impossible to live from the country with your name. You can work only anonymously now. It's not only about investigative journalists, it's actually about all the independent journalists and even about bloggers who write about politics or something like this. So we've known more about our investigations like Navalny poisoning or Salisbury attack or downing of MH17, but actually one of our main focuses was fighting disinformation and investigations of how propaganda works. So we know how it's structured very well. So since 2013, we published dozens of investigations of how it works. And if we speak about what's happening inside the country, like about this environment that was changing under Putin, there were like three main stages. So actually, Putin went after journalists right in the beginning of his power. And several weeks after inauguration, he arrested Gusinsky, owner of NTV channel, one of main oppositional TV channels. And in several years, he took control over all the TV. And that was enough in the early 2000s because most of Russian populations were like TV centralized. Then after, I would say 2011, after big protests in Russia, they also started going after internet. But they did it through mostly economic measures. So they just pressured the owners and investors of big independent media, including print and internet. So when we appeared in 2013, it was already this toxic environment where only very small internet projects registered abroad could exist and survive. And it appeared that a project like ours became very successful. So there was flourishing of different investigative and just independent media with young journalists working from different countries, including Russia. And it was very difficult for the system to suppress us because we had no like investors from inside the country or like any registration from inside. So Russian investigations were prospering for many years. And I would even claim that Russian investigative journalism is the strongest in Russian history now, and possibly one of the strongest in the world, if we see the scale of how big our stories that we are now breaking are. But last year, as I already mentioned, there was a third wave of suppression of the journalism when they came after, like physically came after all the journalists who were working from inside. And it started last spring, a year ago. And we didn't understood it at that time, but now I understand that it was a preparation for invasion into Ukraine, like new invasion that started last month. So Putin just wanted to clear the space inside the country from journalists and activists. He didn't want protests inside during the war. And when war started in February, he closed like all the rest media that still were working, like TV Rain or Novaya Gazeta and others. So hundreds of Russian journalists had to leave the country. And speaking about how they operate abroad, I think that we can't even treat this media, like governmental media, as a media actually, because it's a part of the government, and they deliberately spread disinformation. So this is not a kind of question of different opinions. It's they see it as a part of informational warfare, and it's literally part of a warfare, hybrid warfare, because if you see, for example, what happened in 2014, Russia successfully invaded those parts of Ukraine where the propaganda was very successful, and a very big share of Ukrainian population watched Russian TV and believed the stories about crucified boys by Ukrainian Nazi, etc., etc. The same you see actually during the new invasion, that why it was not very successful. It is because Ukraine blocked TV channels that were owned by Medvedchuk, like Putin's one of Putin's cronies, that also deliberately spread propaganda and disinformation. So after these TV channels and internet sites were blocked on territory of Ukraine, we see that the popularity of these pro-Russian forces became less and less. So we have in world's history, we have a lot of examples, like during Nuremberg Tribunal, during Rwanda Tribunal, we saw that actually media were claimed responsible for the genocide and for inciting violence, because that's what they were doing there in Rwanda. That's what were like this radio RTML, or of course all this Nazi propaganda. They were inciting violence, and that's what we are seeing now on Russian TV channels. They're openly saying about like how we should start a nuclear war against West, what other countries we should invade, why it is right to invade Ukraine. Is what they're explicitly saying. It's not just like, again, it's not an opinion. It's just inciting violence. So and also speaking about disinformation, it's not again like some people believe in conspiracy theories and then transmit it to other countries. Not at all. If you see in Russia what Russia today tells to foreign audience and what they tell to Russian audience, it's very different, because during the coronavirus crisis, all the Russia Today editorials in European and Western countries were saying that actually vaccination is very dangerous and that you shouldn't be afraid of virus, etc., etc. And the same TV channel inside Russia were inciting vaccination and saying that you must be vaccinated against coronavirus. So it looks like it was a deliberate strategy to spread mistrust in these countries to their governments, to intensify conflicts. And sometimes it's disinformation. Sometimes they just pick one topic and make and exaggerate it. For example, if we speak about Denmark, we don't usually have news about Denmark in Russia. The only one piece of news from Denmark I remember is when they killed a giraffe in a zoo. Possibly was not the best thing to do, but still, only when there was a big scandal about this killing of giraffe, it was translated in all TV channels. For it had a very big coverage. And if you ask just a random people from Moscow, like, what do you know about Denmark? He would say, like, is it the country when they kill giraffes in the zoo? So it's how it works, you know. It's not a journalism at all. And I think that it's not right to question if we should close the access to Russia Today in Europe. The right question is that we should close these disinformation channels inside Russia, first of all, because this is dangerous also for Russian people, because these people see these stories about crucified boys in Ukraine and then take guns and go to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. You know, this is really dangerous. And now I think we should, on the edge of nuclear war, we should understand that this is also a security issue and we should treat it as a security issue.
Thank you very much, Roman. So let me just ask to be very clear. So you are saying that you totally support the EU measure to put restrictions or censorship, if you want to call it that, on Russia Today and on Sputnik.
Yeah, but I think that this is not enough at all, because if we treat this as a security issue, that means that you need not just to close this actually not very popular TV media in Europe, because it also is very important to support Russian language initiatives that would give an alternative, that will give real information about what's going on in Europe, in Russia. And there are now a lot of journalists living in Europe who would happily participate in this independent media to work there, but they need financing. If Western countries would spend 1% of their military budget, like annual military budget, on supporting of independent media, that would be dozens of billions of dollars. That's far more than all the Russian, Chinese, Turkish and other media together. It would be a real big impact.
Okay. That's a very specific proposal. Spend some of the military budget to actually spread actual information into Russia. I want to ask you this question, though. You're a representative of a media who has experienced having your door opened by the FSB, being harassed, having your computers checked, and having relatives being harassed by the Russian authorities. So what about this argument that you hear a lot from Danish and other Western media to say that when we start doing something like this, putting limits on RT and Sputnik, then we actually give the Russian government an argument that they have the right to do the same thing, that they're just doing the same thing, there is no difference?
Well, as soon as you would start break into the apartments of Russian journalists in Europe and steal their computers, harass them, and put them in prison, that would be a very questionable measure, and possibly I would be against this. But if we speak that we should just stop amplifying disinformation that is inciting violence, I think it is the only one possible thing to do, because we see people really dying by thousands because of this disinformation. You know, if you speak with Russian soldiers in Ukraine and their relatives who are staying now in Russia, they would repeat all these narratives about Nazis in Ukraine and blah blah blah. So it really works. We can't just pretend that this is just a question of different opinions of free media, etc. This is not media at all.
So, in your opinion, has the West been naive in its approach to Russia? We know during the Cold War that America had Voice of America. They had radio stations and television stations that tried to give a Western point of view to audiences also outside of the West. Have we forgotten to use this tool over the last decades, in your opinion?
Yes, I think that the Western countries underestimated the danger of these disinformation campaigns, and they started noticing it only in 2016 when Russia interfered in American elections. And then they started noticing that actually Russia is interfering in most of Western countries in their internal politics and supporting, I don't know, Le Pen, AfD in Germany, etc., etc. They started opening their eyes. And only now, after the war in Ukraine and dozens of thousands of people killed, I think only now Western countries understand the scale of the costs of this blindness and passiveness.
Let me ask you one more question. I think most of us realize that you cannot trust much of what is coming out of RT and Sputnik, and that they are deliberately trying to divert attention and to set a Russian-inspired agenda. My feeling is that most Western people who have actually met content from Russia Today or from Sputnik have done so because of via social media channels, mostly Facebook, probably also Twitter and other social media channels. What, in your opinion, is the role and the responsibility of the tech companies in the Russian misinformation campaign?
Well, I think that now, after the invasion, a new invasion, these big tech companies are already reacting. We see that, for example, YouTube channels of our main propagandists were blocked, and they are trying to delete trolls, like troll fabrics that work for the Kremlin, in Twitter and Facebook. So they're doing something, but possibly it is not enough, especially if we speak about how they tolerate censorship inside Russia, because Russia is now censoring, trying to censor Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, everything. So I think there must be European Union regulation that will forbid censorship in third countries, not only inside European Union, but also in other countries like Russia or China. So like if this big company is deliberately, for example, giving information to FSB about Russian journalism, or close some sources, independent sources of information, unlawfully close them because of orders of Vladimir Putin, that must be punished in Europe, because it's violation of international laws, actually. So that will, because for Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Europe and America is much more important as a market than Russia. So if they would have to choose between European and Russian regulation, of course they will choose European regulation, but no one is punishing them for censorship in Russia. So that must be some European regulation.
So your concern with Facebook, for example, is more that they are accepting censorship in Russia than the fact that they are disseminating Russian content in Europe and the States.
Yeah, well, they're trying to regulate this too, and of course, possibly there must be some regulation, but I don't think that this is now the major problem, because I don't see that the Russian propaganda in Facebook and in YouTube in Western countries is very influential. But possibly something can be done. But this is a question of dialogue also, because there must be some concrete rules what we treat as disinformation and what is an opinion. It can be, I think, these rules can exist, but we need to think about how to still keep the freedom of expression.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roman. I now want to turn to Helsinki. I assume, I'm not sure, but Jessikka, I think you are in Helsinki right now. Jessikka Aro, you are also, just like Roman, an award-winning investigative journalist. You work for the Finnish public service media Yle, and you have specialized in Russia, in extremism and information warfare. And in 2014, I believe, you began researching the pro-Kremlin trolls on social media and their influence on public debates outside of Russia's borders. And this, you can maybe tell us more about that, has made you a target of serious and ongoing Russian propaganda campaigns. And also I want to mention that in 2019 you released the best-selling book Putin's Trolls that will be out in paperback in English very shortly. So we want to note that as well. Jessikka, please give us a little bit of insight into what you actually found out during your investigations.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And I want to thank Roman for your excellent work and your groundbreaking work. In such horrible circumstances, I'm thankful for your journalism. So yes, I will today address Russian tool of information warfare, the RT, as well as what I found out in my investigations into the Russian trolls and their international impact, and specifically how they influence real people outside Russia's border. And I will also address some of those field campaigns that RT is also very actively engaging in, also across Russian borders, against civilians who are critical or even voice out facts about the Kremlin. So first, here's actually similar stuff that already Søren put out, but repetition is never bad for you. So this is where I'm coming from and how I'm looking at this topic. As a journalist, it really has struck me that in Russia, journalism is seen as some kind of information weapon, and mass media especially is seen as weapon. And Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Secretary of Defense, has said it himself already back in 2014. And he's still the minister, and you can still see him actively conducting information operations almost on a daily basis in international information space. Also, I'd like to point out to the 2014 Russian military doctrine, which according to Finnish researchers was updated heavily to support the information defense, as Russia sees itself as a big victim of Western and US and NATO information aggression, of which it needs to protect from. And then 2017, this is important too, Sergei Shoigu has said himself that they have founded in Russia these information warfare troops, when in fact I actually believe that they have been created much earlier. For example, I found Putin himself saying on Kremlin's website that they have designed, for example, RT at least ever since 2005. So this is how Putin himself is looking after these operations and also in charge of many of them. And then let's go to the next slide, please. Just to quickly show what also Søren already showed, really interestingly, how the Russians are really open about it. So when I want to really, especially the Danish journalist friends there, to see that when discussing RT, we are not discussing journalistic media or even a media, or if we are, then it's maximum fake media, which is spreading fake news. But in fact, when it's a tool of information warfare, freedom of speech, as written in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's actually a human right meant for people, for humans, and also for journalists. But RT, as tool of information warfare, does not have that right. It actually destroyed that right from many others, and its tool of oppression and harassment, as many have already pointed out. Next slide, please. This is where it all started for me. Obviously, I had been reported about Ukraine and Russia's secret warfare in Ukraine already back in 2014 when I started my troll investigation. And as a journalist, it was super difficult to find out what was actually going on, to use the right words, because Russia was heavily impacting and influencing the public debate by spreading conspiracy theories about Ukraine and by claiming that Russia does not even wage war against Ukraine. So in addition to that, there was a new phenomenon of Russian information warfare, new technique, a so-called troll factory being set up in St. Petersburg, which the super brave Russian journalists actually first found and infiltrated in and made stories in Novaya Gazeta, for example. And I wanted to research, how do these trolls operate, in which channels, how do they impact real people, do Finnish people actually, how do they react to this? Because I knew that propaganda has the power to really influence in real people's ideas, attitudes, and even behavior. So I saw the trolls at that time already as a freedom of speech threat. But later I realized, I wrote about it in 2016 in one report, that it's also, these trolls are also a threat to national security in many countries. So please, next. Then, as part of this investigation, my colleague Mika Mäkeläinen and our awesome Russian stringer, we investigated Russian troll factory in St. Petersburg. And for example, we found out that it is actually part of a state structures, because the stupidest security guard in the world actually gave it out himself as we were filming outside the main entrance of the factory. This was February 2015, and the guard came out and started yelling at us that, girls, you have to go away or else I will call the police. Can't you see that this is regime is done? So administrative building. So in Russia, administrative buildings are always especially protected state structures. So, and already we checked out their recruitment ads at that time, and they were recruiting people to work in 12-hour shifts during nights also, and also to produce material online in English language. And when we called to the recruiter and asked for what kind of material do you want me to produce if I work there, they said themselves political. So there was already at that time going on troll operations across the world. Next, please. What I found out in my investigations, for which I exchanged information with almost 200 people, some of them work for example, as moderators of Russian discussion forums in Finland. Some of them were ordinary citizens, users of the internet, and some were security specialists. And what I found out was really alarming. The Russian trolls had already back then, social media propaganda had already back then, 2014, 2015, manipulated Finns. And you know what? These trolls were obsessed about Ukraine. So they were spreading conspiracy theories against Ukraine, claiming that Russia does not wage war against Ukraine, claiming that it's European Union and NATO who are waging war against Ukraine, claiming that Petro Poroshenko, the then Ukrainian president, is warmonger. Putin wants only peace and negotiations. And everything was revolving around Ukraine. And the worrying thing was that one of my results was that some of the people really lost the idea what is true and what is not true, for example, in Ukraine, because of this information warfare targeted at them. Also, individual people got targeted for harassment campaigns, also including Russian embassy on social media. And by the way, some of these trolls, they also spread these links. It's a specific form of trolling and using trolls as conveyors of information weapons. Trolls are linking links to Russian state media, for example, RT and others, cross borders internationally. It's super cheap and super quickly. Next, please. Also, proxies in different countries, also in many European Union countries and others, use Russia Today, RT materials, such as What the Fuck paper. Here we have operating in Finland actively ever since 2014. And they translate RT's online fake news stories into Finnish language, because RT does not have a specific designed Finnish version. So What the Fuck paper is their Finnish kind of window, even though this WTF paper claims that they are Finnish and they serve the Finnish people and they serve the news that the mainstream media doesn't serve, which actually is copycatting the RT slogan. Okay, then next, please. Here is then some parts of the attacks that I have been targeted to after I started my investigations. So there has been a multilingual filth campaign, which also has led to indictments. It started from Russia with a Finnish citizen who represents this Moscow Russian Institute of Strategic Studies, whose supervisors are Russian intelligence officers who are appointed by President Putin himself. And this institute, by the way, was found in 2017 to have designed the operation against the US election interference. So then next, please, some examples of these RT filth materials, attack materials. These are against me, and then Martin Krag, a Swedish researcher who in 2017 published a research article detailing Russian influence operations against his home country, Sweden. So he immediately became target of RT and such. And then next, please, some other people who have been targeted for RT/Sputnik, as well as other arms of Russian information warfare. Here we have on the left Serbian think tanker Jelena Milic, who is pro-Western and pro-EU and pro-NATO, and she has been made victim of this fake news in her home country by these Russian state media information warfare arms. Then there's in the right Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat, the volunteer community who started to investigate the downing of MH17 in 2014. He has also been massive target. And under there's Bill Browder, financier, who also happened to be made the enemy of the Kremlin and Putin, and he is victim of massive, still ongoing, years-long, disgusting filth campaign from the RT and Sputnik, as well as other Russian state media. So I will just end here to point it out that I really agree with Raman as well as Søren and their points of views, and I feel that we're so lucky to have these channels blocked in the European Union. I wish they would have been blocked already years ago, and I also view them as security threats, a genuine threat, and they are capable of building hate communities, which are dangerous. And I wish that more of these disinformation and information warfare channels will be blocked too, not just in the EU. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Jessikka. I think your presentation very much speaks for itself. So let me give you one of the questions that we got from the audience. This question is from Mette Rogers, who is the correspondent in London for one of the Danish newspapers, and her question is this: in London's Foreign Press Association, we have members from Russia's state media. As members, they get a British press card and access to politicians and other high-profile... Oh, let me just see, it jumped away there. Oh, I need to get the question back, please. It disappeared a little bit too fast from my screen. Well, her question is, should we basically remove the press accreditation and press cards for Russian state journalists in Western countries like London, or should we let them work as journalists there? Now, Roman said that he thought we should also try to actually stop RT and Sputnik inside of Russia. What is your view on how the West should deal with representatives of these media organizations in Western Europe? Or in the European Union?
Excellent question. Thank you for that. Definitely from those representatives who work for RT and Sputnik and these platforms which have openly declared themselves as tools of information warfare. So these people, I believe Liz might also open that up a little bit more and might have a take on that, but these people might have other tasks than just these so-called reporting tasks. So and also they are being forbid from using certain words. For example, the word invasion or war has been banned in Raptly, which is RT daughter company operating in and from Berlin, actually, interestingly. So as a result, actually many Raptly employees ended up resigning. But not all of them resign. They are still heavily fighting. They know it's information warfare. They just don't care. They get paid and are able and willing to do even dangerous things for that paycheck.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much, Jessikka. And as you mentioned, we have one more panelist who actually knows something about the RT from the inside. So let's now turn to our last panelist of the day, Liz Wall. Liz, you're an American journalist and expert in information warfare, and you appeared in several international news media and documentaries, and you have spoken a lot about topics such as extremism, conspiracy, and disinformation movements. Now, from 2011 to 2014, you were a correspondent and a host at the United States branch of Russia Today. And as some might remember, you made some international headlines when you resigned publicly while you were on screen on Russia Today and said that you would no longer work there. I believe that was in connection with the invasion of Crimea. So, Liz, thank you for being with us, and please tell us a little bit about your experience from working inside RT.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to weigh in on this topic of Russian disinformation and the sanctioning of it. First, I do want to applaud the EU sanctions against RT and Sputnik and argue that these should be among the very first steps in fighting the information war. Of course, as you mentioned, I have a unique perspective on this issue since I worked inside a Russian newsroom and resigned publicly on the air in protest of Russia's disinformation in its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. In the 8 years since then, it has been remarkable to see how much damage Russian disinformation and its manipulation of information on the internet, on social media, on the air, and through its proxies has done to democracies. It's been poisonous to democracies, as we've heard from various speakers, and damaging to individuals like Jessikka that we just heard from, that are advocating for the truth and democratic values. And now, as we see in Ukraine, poisonous propaganda can convince a country that there is a non-existent Nazi government and civilians to exterminate. So even for those that don't believe in the completely outrageous denazification lie inside of the information iron curtain of Russia, Russian disinformation has worked on key Western audiences in surprising ways to pin the blame on the victim and not the invaders, and also to blame the US, the EU, and NATO for Russia's aggression and their invasion. I want to take you back into a Russian-backed newsroom in 2014 and the narratives that the channel pushed. This is when, in my personal experience, Russia's news operations went from plausibly an alternative to mainstream sources as it described itself back then and how it lured Western journalists to dangerous disinformation. It was during this time that the Russian news director directed me as an anchor to focus on the so-called Nazi problem of the Ukrainian government, to deny Russia's involvement in eastern Ukraine. And when it became impossible to deny, as the evidence was mounting, words like invasion were edited out or prohibited. And now that's taken on steroids within Russia. journalists cannot even use the word war to describe what's happening inside Ukraine at the moment. Also during this time, Russia was trying to clearly manufacture a justification for invading a sovereign country, and to that end, mobilized its media operations to deny Russia's involvement or to portray any military action as peacekeeping missions aimed at protecting ethnic Russians against a fascist government. Russia's narrative on Ukraine sometimes distorted real events or invented blatantly false narratives. So since this time, in the last 8 years, Russia's disinformation has grown more bold, more deranged, more conspiratorial, and now in Ukraine, deadly. After my departure, Russia would use its various media channels, online trolls, as we heard from Jessikka, fake journalists, extremist websites, and partnerships with anti-democracy politicians and organizations to deny responsibility in the shooting down of the MH17 plane, which killed nearly 300 passengers on board, and also to spread divisive content and strategically manipulate the news cycles to, for example, help elect former President Trump, a figure that, if reelected, who knows if the US would even still be part of NATO right now, where I'm based right now here at a US Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is hosting members of the NATO alliance to bolster support for Ukraine. This likely would not be happening right now under a Trump-appointed Secretary of Defense. And so that's why Russia uses its disinformation to try to help elect figures like him or like Marine Le Pen. And it's important to note that even when Russia's disinformation does not ultimately succeed in its best case scenarios, it does succeed in weakening support for democratic institutions and alliances like the European Union, like NATO, like the transatlantic relationship between the US, Canada, and Europe, and also for support of Ukraine. We've also seen that Putin used his propaganda machine to deny the bombing of hospitals and the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This, of course, is very worrying because we've seen this playbook in Syria, and it's worrying that usually when they ramp up propaganda or false flag, so-called false flag operations, that they might be planning to do the same thing in Ukraine. And his propaganda machine has culminated, as we've seen, in this invasion of Ukraine, resulting in thousands of civilians dead, an untold number of war crimes, and millions of refugees. So Putin's propagandists and his apologists, I think it's important to note, as previous speakers have asserted, that they're not journalists at this point. They're not media. They're not interested in the truth. Russian media is now under the thumb of one man that has grown murderous, isolated, unhinged, and unpredictable. And outside of its disinformation of Ukraine, Russian media serves to sow chaos, division, and extremism in the democratic world. And Putin wants to break down and diminish institutions like the European Union and NATO in particular. This has been kind of a fixation of his for over a decade at least. And he uses his propaganda machines to try to reinforce this narrative. So the sanctioning of outlets like RT and Sputnik should be the bare minimum. The focus now for those that value truth, democracy, and yes, that value free speech, is to continue to work toward countering authoritarian propaganda and malign information operations. Russia is trying to erase literally Ukraine from the map. It also would like to erase other democracies if it had the opportunity. And if it can't completely destroy Ukraine or other democracies, it will work to degrade and demoralize them and to chip away at trust in our own institutions and at our own unity and our belief in our democratic systems. So to that end, Russia is engaging in an information warfare with the democratic world. And it's time that we acknowledge, as our speakers today have, that there is such an information war, and to fight on the side of truth and democracy. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak with these other journalists that have been working hard to fight the information war.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you for spending time with us today and sharing your perspective. I have about 10 minutes left of this seminar, and I have a lot of questions I want to ask each one of you. But let me start with you, Liz, and just a follow-up question. I think I'm very curious to know, as someone who has, for you, as someone who's worked inside the RT, in your impression, does everybody inside the RT, we know that they hire also a lot of Western journalists. You're an example of it yourself. Does everybody inside the organization know that they are part of a misinformation campaign organization?
I think some journalists do. For example, I worked at the time for the news program, which was more focused. If you think of something like Fox News, they have their kind of extremist opinion hosts and their news channels. I was working for the news channels. But an interesting thing and an important thing to remember is that there are some true believers that work for RT that are highly critical. They call themselves anti-imperialists. In this case, they tend to actually sympathize with authoritarian regimes. They're very conspiratorial. And so there is, and as we see even just in the latest election in France, that there actually is an audience of this populist nationalism. There is people of a big proportion of our democracies that are actually receptive to this type of narrative, to this type of information, of disinformation. And it's those types of audiences and those types of true believer journalists that Russia tries to amplify, tries to mobilize. And so there is kind of a mix of true believers, the conspiracy theorists, and those that do know better, but don't really care.
I'm also curious, what made you take the job in the first place? Did you see any red flags, or were you just curious? What made you sign on in the first place?
Yeah, well, back in the day, this was 2011 when they reached out to me. I was much younger, and Russian disinformation was not even a word that people was in Western vocabulary. At the time, there was a presidential campaign around the time where Mitt Romney was laughed at for saying that Russia was our biggest geopolitical foe. So the timing and the kind of the zeitgeist and our understanding of Russia's aggression in the world was much different. Mm-hmm. And I think the world was naive. I was when I checked out Russia's reporting at the time, they did what they purported to do, which was cover stories that the mainstream media ignores. And a lot of times stories that are true are actually make the West look like we have problems, because we do. We're all imperfect democracies, right? It was 2000. Yes. And it was 2014, I think, when it took that turn from alternative to the mainstream media to outright propaganda machine, in this case, to support a war.
And one final question this round for you is, I think as an American, you know better than any one of us that to some extent the Fox News media organizations play a little bit of the same role. Of course, there are differences. For example, they are not state-run, at least not directly. There were clear connections during the Trump presidency, but they're not state-run, of course. But please let us know, what difference do you see? Because some would say, if you want to go this hard after Russia today, then why are we not targeting Fox News?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you asked that, because the evolution of Fox News since 2014 has been alarming. The way in which Fox News and commentators like Tucker Carlson, actually RT, and within Russia, they actually just roll video of one of our commentators, our far-right commentators, Tucker Carlson, because he essentially just echoes Russian propaganda, the most conspiratorial of it. And so Russia's happy to just air that video and use Western voices as a tool, saying, hey, they believe it again. They believe it in the US themselves. So, and I think it's an example of how Russian media has been, or Russian disinformation has been able to mobilize and grow kind of these anti-system parties, whether they're on the far right in the US with the Trump administration. We've seen, and after January 6th, we've seen the growing of this far right party, which has some kind of a strange alliance with Russian narratives, conservative narratives, and so on. And so it's unfortunately, we have a problem where at times Fox News and RT has become indistinguishable. So as we're grappling with this in the United States, for example, perhaps it's time that we should have some kind of journalistic code of conduct. If you're spreading conspiracy theories knowingly, disinformation knowingly, which is putting, a security risk or risking public health, for example, that there should be some code of conduct, because as the fourth estate, journalism should work and bolster the truth and to inform citizens, because misinformation and disinformation, as we've learned over the last decade, can be deadly.
Right. Thank you so much. Now let me go on in the backward direction and turn back to you, Jessikka. Going back to the other panelists, I want to give you a chance to answer a little bit to one of the first arguments that Allan Thulstrup made here in the studio about the slippery slope risk, that once we've done this, there is no turning back, and everyone can agree maybe that RT and Sputnik are extreme media organizations, or maybe not even media organizations, but you've kind of opened the door to doing this. And for example, there are many people in the EU who legitimately feel that the EU should go away. So is there now a risk that every media organization that is campaigning against the European Union should risk being banned? I think that is one of the fears that we hear in the debate. What is your take on that?
Right. Yeah. It's understandable take, of course, and it works when discussing about journalistic media and regular media that are done by regular citizens, journalists, free people who want to do content for other people. So RT, Sputnik, content like that, it's just not media. So I don't even see how it could be censored. In my view, it cannot be censored because it's a propaganda arm of some foreign government. So it's just a complete different thing, and it should be treated as one. It does not enjoy these privileges or rights as media and journalism.
Okay, thank you. That's a very clear point. Let me go back to you, Roman. There's a question here from the audience, from Leif Lundsman, who says, when US Congress in 1964 mandated the CIA to finance Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, it was clearly stated that the mission of the Russian language media was to persuade, not simply to inform. Do you think it's legitimate if Russia bans these outlets? Just repeat your answer, please, because we need your sound on. I was surprised that didn't happen before, but now.
Yeah, sorry. So, well, first of all, Russia already banned all the independent media, like not only like the Western ones, but all the independent media and bloggers. So we have nothing to lose. But speaking about how it can be governed and how this money to independent journalists can be invested, I think that the best mechanism that we see right now is that we have a different foundation, like, I don't know, European Endowment for Democracy and others, where we see some experts who understand what are the independent Russian media, how this or that media are effective or not. So they are funded from, for example, European Union, and then they decide where to put this money, like in what projects. So there is a number of these foundations, and their only motivation is to see some good projects prospering, having like good quotations, different journalistic awards, etc. So the stimulus is right, and it's about journalism. It's not about some political aims. I don't think it would be correct and right if some political bodies would create their own media for some political aims, because it also will not be a journalism. But this new grant-funded type of journalism appeared to be very effective, at least in Russia, because we see around a dozen of small investigative projects breaking very important stories about corruption, about security services in Russia killing people, about war in Ukraine, etc., etc. And this is a small but effective groups of Russian journalists now living abroad. And I think this can be effective, and you can make it like something bigger. They can grow into some, I don't know, some possible even journalistic corporation.
Okay, thank you very much. Allan, I think one of the very important points that we've heard several times over the last hour, we heard it from Jessikka and from other members of the panel is that we need to stop thinking about RT and Sputnik as media organizations as such. They're actually weapons in the hands of the Russian military. Now, I think, does that affect your view or your concerns about restricting access to these media? Do you accept that you can differentiate between media organizations and state military operations?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate that we can, but I am not sure. My concern is that the sanctioning itself can be used as ammunition by the Russians in RT Africa, RT Latin America, and so forth. The pure action of sanctioning, whether it was RT or Sputnik or anything else, opens the door to sanctions in the future, and accusations to the EU that we are sanctioning media, whether or not we recognize them as media or not, they could be viewed as media in other countries and in countries far away. So I think that would be my answer, yes.
Okay, thank you. And let me then turn to you. And then finally, after this question, I have one final question that I also would like to have your take on, the three panelists who are outside of the studio. But just let me turn back to you and go back to the very beginning, Søren Liborius, because I also received a lot of questions here on the screen about this censorship argument. I really think a lot of people are having difficulty understanding how we can have a German constitution, a Danish constitution, obviously more constitutions in Europe that are actually explicitly saying that you could never have censorship again, and yet they perceive this as censorship, and their question have two elements. One is, why don't we call it by its name? And the second thing is, of course, whether it's the right tool to use. And maybe I should put the question like this: has the EU been good enough at explaining the drama of this decision that was taken in March to restrict these organizations?
Let me start. First of all, of course, thanking all the viewers for putting this question, which is a very important distinction to discuss, and I appreciate that. Upholding the right to have freedom of speech is central. That's the first. And there is, of course, nobody in the EU that takes such a decision lightly, as we've also heard it's the first time. And before everybody sees the EU as this big monster that kills freedom of media in Europe, let's just pause a second and say, hey, we're actually spending a lot of resources to support good, honest, credible, free media by Russian journalists, Ukrainians as well. So there is nothing further away from the EU than limiting the free debate. If everybody listens to von der Leyen, to Charles Michel, to Joseph Borrell, or any EU leader, they are upholding the vibrant, free democracy. So just, pause a second. Secondly, censorship, if people are more comfortable with saying, yes, there is censorship on access to Russia Today and Sputnik, if that makes people calm and they say, okay, it's not just a restriction, I think personally, from a professional and personal perspective, it is just not precise. If people are happy with not being precise in their vocabulary, I can do nothing about it. It's not an arrogant statement, but I just think that censorship is a process where there is a decision to say to a journalist, you cannot write this, you have to write that. I mean, Lise described the processes. And as I said in the beginning, we are not targeting Russian journalists, RT or Sputnik journalists even working inside the EU. They can do research, they can do interviews. We do not, as I said, freeze assets. So those people that are saying we are doing the same as Putin, it is simply because people do not understand what's going on in Russia. Journalists are arrested, they are kicked out, media are closed. Nothing happens of that in the EU. Secondly, what is the, in your second question, what is the right, so to speak? Is this restricting people's access to RT and Sputnik? Yes, it is. We are certainly not denying that. And that leads us into another very fundamental discussion. That is what I would call the hierarchy of rights. And there is actually an ongoing court case raised by the RT France against the European Council decision. And it is ongoing in an expedited format, so we wait for the verdict of the European Court of Justice. But in its first ruling, in its initial ruling about RT France's quest to have their rights reinstated to broadcast, the judge established a reasoning saying there is a hierarchy of rights. You can of course not be deprived your rights to a dignified life, protection against torture and so on, but you can limit the right to conduct a private business that is part of a state organization that is engaged in an information war. So that is an important initial ruling from the court. And I also want to challenge a little bit the perception that there is absolute freedom to do everything you like. I mean, a lot of the viewers, perhaps, if they have studied law, would remember the first year in law school where you go through the case, is it allowed to cry fire in the theater, in the filled theater? And I will not repeat this discussion for young law students, but there is a limitation to what you can do if it is balanced against the interest of society, if it is a measured decision. Now, we also have freedom of assembly in Denmark, but there is also the balance that you can dissolve organizations that promote violence by court. And we are certainly, and let me stress this again, we're into a situation which is extremely particular. If I can just spend one example with the audience here. Imagine a guy coming up, say, hey, I represent the caliphate. And the caliph has given me a large budget. I'm at a war, I promote violence and atrocities, I reject normal journalistic standards, I run a global operations with millions of users, I promote the caliphate, Islamic State and so on. Hey, give me a license to put on content on your web packages and so on. That's the situation we are in.
So you're comparing the Russian operation to what could be an operation of radical Islamists in the sense that they pose a threat to society?
I'm putting, because for the sake of the discussion of principles, I'm putting the challenge to the discussion saying, okay, an information warfare, is that always to be treated as freedom of speech?
Right.
That's the point.
And this is the dilemma I think we've been discussing a lot today. Now, time has run out. I have been allowed to just put one more question out, and I want you, Roman, Jessikka, and Liz to please try to give us your best perspective on this. It's a question that has come from Finland, actually, from Mikael Gottfredsen, who asks a very practical question. He says, how could we, and I think we as Europe or the EU in general, promote the possibility for Russian independent journalists to live and work, for example, in member countries of the EU? There have been some problems for some of them when their 90 days short visa times are running out. And if they're trying to get asylum, they might be in trouble if asylum is denied. So Mikael Gottfredsen is asking, any ideas for alternatives? What can we do to support independent Russian journalists who need a safe space in the EU to do their work? I don't know, Roman, would you like to go first? Do you have any proposals?
Yeah, I think this is a very pressing problem because now I would say several hundred of Russian journalists are now living in outside of Russia, most of them in Europe, and it's very difficult to get
residence permit. It's almost, especially after the war, it's almost impossible to open a bank account. While these people are continuing to work as independent journalists, and we are writing about the war, and we're telling more real facts about the war to Russian people, because we still have this possibility to spread information through social networks and internet. Lots of Russians have VPNs. We have millions of readers, and still it is very difficult to do it like legally, because it's almost impossible with Russian passport to open any bank account or do anything. So if there would be any European regulation that would facilitate opening bank accounts and having residence permits for those journalists who are still working as independent journalists, and I don't know, some organizations like Reporters Without Borders or some other, like some funds like, I don't know, European Endowment for Democracy or some other, can confirm that these people are real journalists, that they're like independent journalists. I think it will be very easy to help them to continue work from Europe.
Great, thank you, Jessikka. Let me go on to you. What are your takes on what we could do to help independent journalism coming out of Russia?
I completely agree with Raman, and network with Russian journalists as well as people who have Russian speaking skills could also be helpful in helping Western journalists to network and find out co-projects, common projects, and international projects. But also, obviously, there is the question of easing the migration regulation. Thanks.
Right. Thank you very much. And Liz, you of course have been working closely with Russian journalists and obviously have a lot of contacts also with people with the same experience. What is your take on this?
Yeah, one in particular journalist that stands out that I've been in contact with, Alexei Kovalyev. I think I'm not mentioning his name properly. I hope I didn't butcher it too badly, but he basically had to flee Russia on foot, and I think he's in Latvia at the moment. And he's asking for support. I want to echo what Roman said in helping to make their transition to the European Union more friendly and more less burdensome. And also perhaps helping to fund these organizations and also collaborating with them and helping to amplify and strengthen their independent reporting in any way that we can.
Thank you. And I think this is a good way to end, because I know that this is also a place where we can build a bridge between all participants today, because I know, Allan, that your organization is working very actively also to support independent Russian journalists.
Exactly. In various European networks, we are trying to help as many Russians as possible to do fair, independent reporting on Russia. Yeah.
Great. I want to thank all 5 of you for spending time with us today. It has been really interesting, and even though we did not get through all the questions that we had, I also want to thank the audience for being so active and putting so excellent questions to the panelists. Please remember that if you want to review some of this or share it with friends and colleagues, there will be a link to share the whole event and to watch it for the first time or even again if your heart desires. Thank you very much for being with us today, and hope to see you back for a more cheerful discussion on these topics in the near future.